when the white people got this country, he says that all we want is the land, the depth of the plow. And what did he mean by that? Now he owns it right down to the end of the world.
In the mid-1600s, Europeans made contact with First Nations of Turtle Island. These First Nation groups were independent nations with their own laws, languages, agreements, and territories. Therefore, it was decided that in order to live peacefully together, agreements needed to be made to outline the relationships. This would also assist in trade and military alliances to reflect a mutual commitment to work together as allies. These initial agreements continued to evolve to include areas of land that would allow for settlement and farming for people who were arriving looking to settle. These agreements are now called treaties. Treaties are legally binding agreements that set out the rights, responsibilities, and relationships of First Nations and the federal and provincial governments. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties that were made with the various nations. Each treaty is unique and still plays an important role in the management of lands and resources in Ontario, and the rights, responsibilities, and relationships that were outlined are still alive and as important as the day they were signed. These rights that were included within the treaties are protected by subsection 35(1) of the Canadian Constitution Act from 1982. One of the nations that was a part of the treaty process was the Mississauga Nation, who between 1781 to 1923 were signatories to 18 various treaties. Prior to the treaty process, the Mississauga Nation's territory was a vast area that stretched from Niagara Falls to the St. Lawrence River and as far north as the French River in present-day Ontario. Long before the arrival of Europeans, the peoples of Turtle Island, what we now call North America, had their own ways of defining relationships between nations, using wampum.
The story of wampums goes back a long way. We gave a lot of honor to the seashell called the quoag shell that is found around Cape Cod area. And all of northeastern North America treasured this shell. And they made them into little beads. And with these beads, they made belts. These were like an agreement, pact that we had with North America people. Everybody understood that if you made an agreement and the women would put together a beaded belt, as they call them, wampum belt, that this was symbolic of that agreement, and it would last forever. And every year you'd come together to go over the story of that belt. It's like a oral contract, but symbolized with these beads as a reminder of that story. In the copied wampum, it's just as meaningful as the original. It's not necessarily that you have to keep the original, but as long as you remember the story, it can be remade. We have what we call the Yellowhead wampum, which is an agreement that was made between the Haudenosaunee and us. Basically, that they stay within their area and we stay within our area, but we would meet certain times to solidify our friendship. Another one is a wampum we call a dish with one spoon, which is probably one of the most misunderstood wampums. When the Haudenosaunee asked us if they could come here and hunt, we said, well, yeah, you can come up here and hunt when you come up and do the friendship circle or smoke the pipe. You are allowed to hunt during that period of time, but not forever. The way they interpret it today is that this is also their hunting ground, which is not the way it is. The probably most significant is the wampum that was exchanged around 1764.
Known as the Covenant Chain, the wampum depicts the First Nations and English linked together. The belt signifies a promise that when the two peoples met, they would polish the silver chain and renew the ties of their friendship. The belt was presented to the Mississauga and 23 other First Nations in 1764 at the signing of the Treaty of Niagara, which transferred a 4-mile strip of land on the west banks of the Niagara River to the British. This allowed the English to travel freely between Lakes Erie and Ontario to support military and commercial relationships. Many First Nations upheld this alliance by supporting Britain in the War of 1812, ensuring the survival of British North America. This was the first treaty to be negotiated after the Crown had made the Royal Proclamation of 1763.
By the mid-1750s, ideas start to be formulated in the minds of people like William Johnson to transfer the responsibility for First Nations trade and relations to the imperial government. Taking it out of the hand of the colonists, they needed to cultivate and maintain the relationship with the First Nations. The Royal Proclamation set out to establish a boundary between the American colonists on the eastern seaboard and the First Nations west of a line drawn across the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. In essence, it established a large Indian reserve, for lack of a better term, which was basically off limits to settlement, to traders, and could only be taken up in treaties with the Crown. So it established the treaty process, in essence.
For a long time, the Europeans, French and English, who were in what is now Canada, understood completely that they needed to ask permission from the First Nations peoples that they dealt with before they navigated the rivers through their territory or before they went in and started helping themselves to resources. There was a tremendous influx of settlement in the early 1800s. And in order to open up that land for settlement, for these waves and waves and waves of people that were coming over from Europe, the government, at that time, imperial government, knew that there had to be treaties. They had to deal with the people that were already living there. The process that was supposed to take place under the Royal Proclamation, it was a quite detailed matter. The treaties were only to be negotiated with a properly authorized representative of the Crown. There was supposed to be a public assembly so that all of these First Nations peoples who had an interest in the land and the outcome would be consulted about it. And under no circumstances were settlers or individuals or third parties who were not kind of these deputized Crown representatives supposed to enter into treaties. And I think the number of land claims that we have in the queue now, which number in the many hundreds, point to the fact that often didn't happen. Some of them were better than others. Some of them were not done very well at all. Many of them were never written up. The documentation was simply left blank. In some cases, I think the people who came to negotiate the treaties left with remarkably different views as to what they had just agreed to.
We're the original people of the North Shore of Lake Ontario. We're the salmon people. Any river that flowed into Lake Ontario had salmon runs. Writers of history describe how you could literally walk across these rivers at a certain time of year because of the number of salmon. This was attractive to us. Over time, the salmon were disappearing, the food sources were disappearing, settlement was moving in and displacing our people. The colonial governments said to us, we're agricultural people, we're farmers, that's all we want to do. You can keep your river mouths, you can keep the shorelines of your rivers and shoreline of Lake Ontario. We wanted to keep all of the wetlands, and they said, oh yeah, you keep all the wetlands. We wanted to keep all the maple sugar bushes. Oh yes, you can keep all the maple sugar bushes. We wanted to keep the rice beds, the wild rice beds, and yes, so you can keep all the rice beds. And all the islands, by the way, too. But when the smoke cleared, that was not written into the treaties.
The Royal Proclamation is set down in 1763, but if we fast forward to 1783, that's the first substantial land purchase, treaty, agreement between the Mississauga Nation and the Crown, and that occurs in what is today the Upper St. Lawrence and the Eastern end of Lake Ontario. And that's called the Crawford Purchase, 1783, 1784. And even though the Royal Proclamation had set down the process generally as to how the treaty process would take place, the Crawford Purchase is probably one of the worst examples of that process.
At Carleton Island on October 29, 1783, a proposal was made to the Mississaugas to purchase land along the Bay of Quinte. The British wanted to reward their Iroquois allies who had fought alongside of them during the American Revolution. There is no documentation as to who signed the agreement on behalf of the Mississauga or who received the payment for the purchase. The only record of the sale is a letter dated August 14, 1794, stating that all of the Indians who had an interest in the lands purchased in October 1783 had been paid.
The next treaty along Lake Ontario was the Gunshot Treaty. Another treaty or purchase or settlement that is not written down. It's not, there's no lands that were delineated in the Gunshot Treaty.
The Gunshot Treaty is one of those treaties that was so vague and poorly defined. I could probably point you to 10 academic articles where there's a different idea as to what it is.
The Gunshot Treaty, as far as we understand, was a treaty basically to allow troops to move back and forth from Frontenac to York at the time, because at that time they had to use the water all the time if they were going to move between forts. And the term gunshot came from the gunshot being able to be heard if you shot it at the shore of Lake Ontario. The treaty or the area that they could use for moving, transporting military would be as far back as you could hear that shot. Must have been a hell of a shot because, boy, they took it all the way to Rice Lake, for example, which is, probably 20 miles as the crow flies. So,
a common misunderstanding that I saw throughout Ontario, but certainly in southern Ontario, was what it was that was being given up. Just to talk about giving up land, what does that mean? Or is it 6 inches of the surface? And you'll often hear elders say, well, they told us it was the depth of the plow. That's what we understood. How could we give up anything else? It's the Creator's. We didn't own it to give it away. And part of that problem is the impossibility of translating concepts of land ownership to communities that don't own land the way that Europeans do. So whoever was doing the translating, and certainly at that period of time there would have been translators, there'd be very few people who would have been able to communicate fluently in each other's languages. We don't know what words they borrowed to try to explain those concepts or how those might have been conveyed to the people receiving them, because they just don't exist. And if they don't exist, it means there's no commonality. You're not using a common dictionary. And there's really no way to untangle that afterwards to find out what people were told or how they might have understood it.
Over the next 34 years, more treaties were signed between the British and the Mississauga to allow for small pockets of land to be taken up. These included the 1784 Grand River Treaty to allow for more settlement lands for the Iroquois, the 1787 Toronto Treaty, the 1792 Mackenzie Treaty, which corrected inaccuracies in the 1784 Grand River Treaty, the 1792 Simcoe Treaty, where Lord Simcoe set aside lands in the present-day regional municipality of York, the townships of East Gwillimbury, North Gwillimbury, Georgina, and Whitchurch, for hunting, fishing, and sole occupation by the Mississauga, the 1794 Brant Treaty, the 1805 Toronto Treaty, which expanded and clarified inaccuracies in the earlier 1787 Toronto Treaty, the 1805 Claus Treaty, and the 1811 Thurlow Treaty.
The early surrenders took up the land along the Lake Ontario frontier, and that was post-American Revolution. And then the War of 1812 interjected, 1811, 1812 to 1815, and that proved to the British how vulnerable the border was with the Americans. And so in order to fortify the borderlands, then they looked for land inland behind the old treaties. So 1818, the southern boundary wraps its way around the bottom end of Rice Lake and sort of is on top of the Gunshot Treaty. The importance of 1818 Treaty Number 20 is that when you read into the treaty itself, when you read the minutes, it's very important when you read the minutes, one can feel the pain and the almost desperation of the people at the time. They were still reliant on living off the land and trying to extract a living from their natural resources.
When we made the treaty in 1818, we kept the islands for our own sustenance. About 1851, the government came back and said, we're tired of paying your schools, we're tired of paying for your church and your missionaries and your school teachers. We're going to sell your islands so that we could run your First Nation. Of course, what that means to me, we're paying for our own colonization, right? So that went on for years, where the Indian agents were selling these islands for hardly anything, right? If you went to the land records right today, there'd be like islands sold, major islands, like an acre island. It was like they'd sell it for 25 cents, 50 cents. Today, a lot of rich cottages are on those islands.
With most of the treaties, the Mississauga were promised payment for the lands they ceded in colonial funds or settlement-promoting trade goods, like suits of clothes, farming implements, or firearms. Some treaties stipulated a single payment, while others promised annual gifts, which often evaporated after a few years or failed to materialize at all. In the case of the Rice Lake Treaty, which originally promised an annual annuity of £790 in goods forever, a clause was later inserted stating that instead each man, woman, and child who had been alive in 1818 would receive $10 annually, and the payments would cease with their deaths. Hunting territories were integral to the Mississauga's ability to live in a traditional way. As settlement pressure continued to increase in the early decades of the 1800s, the colonial government began sending surveyors into the Ottawa Valley looking for additional lands that could be taken up by the settlers. These lands were still the traditional hunting grounds of the Mississauga, which resulted in disputes between settlers and the Mississauga. To ease these conflicts, the British presented the Rideau Treaty between 1819 and 1822, which ceded lands to the east of the Kawartha Lakes and north to the Ottawa River to the British.
Land was being allotted to settlers, and those settlers found Anishinaabe First Nation people living on that property, and they wanted them out. So the government says, well, we'll put them in one spot, like a community. And so they elicited, apparently, the help of missionaries. So the missionaries came here and started several communities. So that's how this community was born. And that's how Rice Lake was born, and Grape Island. As those communities grew, there was movement between the three communities, and they did get some agricultural land in order to make them farmers. That's what the plan of the government was to do, to make them farmers and to get them living in one spot.
In the 1800s, in an attempt to encourage farming and settlement of the First Nations, the government developed the reserve system. Many of the larger nations were divided into smaller family groups and given small areas of land called reserves. We now refer to them as communities. Today, there are 6 Mississauga First Nation communities that reside on a land base much smaller than their traditional territory. New Credit is the most southerly, encompassing 5,914 acres between Lakes Erie and Ontario, while the most northerly is the Mississauga 8, made up of 4,886 acres on Lake Huron. And to the east, the remaining Mississauga communities can be found near the Kawartha Lakes, with Scugog at 638 acres, Alderville at 2,965 acres, Hiawatha at 2,145 acres, and Curve Lake at 2,224 acres. By the mid-1800s, the colonial government was looking for an inland transit route that would bypass the lower Great Lakes and potential American military threats. Running through Mississauga territory was a system of lakes and rivers that, with some infrastructure, could be navigated by both military and commercial vessels. In the 1830s, construction began on what would come to be known as the Trent-Severn Waterway. Eventually, 12,000 acres of Mississauga land would be flooded by the system. In the 1856 Islands of the Trent Treaty, the remaining islands were surrendered, with the government promising that any funds raised from their sale would be placed into a trust for the Mississauga. In the same year, Treaty No. 77 was signed for a number of islands in the Bay of Quinte at the terminus of the system, and the same promise of a trust was made. Neither promise was fulfilled.
We lost some of our old campgrounds with the coming of the Trent Canal, meaning that they were flooded out. We're very much attracted to living on islands and burying our people on islands. That flooding of 6 feet on Buckhorn, Chemung Lake really annihilated, destroyed a lot of our grave sites. That was catastrophic.
We started here from first contact, essentially, through the treaty process up to some point in the 1800s, with the people dealing with First Nations having a pretty clear understanding that they were visitors to this country. And so fundamentally, conceptually, that refers to understanding that a grant of whatever privileges is given is coming from the First Nations to the newcomers, to the visitors, to the Europeans, and not the other way around. I often blame a series of legal opinions that were given in the 1860s for the change in that thinking. Some of the Crown law officers took a fairly technical viewpoint as to whether it was even possible for quote, Indians to have special rights. The legal approach they took wasn't very sound. But their conclusion that Aboriginal people had no special rights, that they had only the rights that were granted to them by the Crown, took hold pretty quickly. And it's one that serves the objectives of the people at the time, got rid of a big problem for them if that was the case.
At the same time, in 1867, the British North America Act was passed, with Clause 91, Section 24, granting jurisdiction over First Nations and First Nation reserved lands to the federal government of Canada. As settler and government views on First Nation relationships began to change, the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Scugog, and the Chippewa of Rama, Georgina Island, and Beausoleil started to notice that their northern harvesting areas, which were never surrendered to the Crown, were being settled.
Starting in about, I think it was 1866, one of the band members from one of the First Nations began complaining that some of his traditional hunting territory had been encroached on, and that white hunters were now moving in and hunting in that area. And that problem continued. Muskrat trapping was becoming a real issue. There were times when the muskrat trappers in First Nations were going out and not just having their traps removed, but they were being shot at, or they were putting their traps down, going back to lift them later and finding that the fur-bearing animals had been removed and the traps had been broken. So the Williams Treaties were the result of about 60 or 70 years of complaints that had been made by members of the various First Nations.
In the late 1800s, our people said to the government, "You are settling into our territory which has never been ceded to you." And finally, the government said one day, "Okay, we'll form a commission to investigate your claim." And so they went around here on every First Nation, had hearings.
And when they had the Williams Treaty, I was 5 years old. I remember going over there because I lived right across the road and eavesdropping through the windows and wondering who these guys were. They were speaking a different language than I'd ever heard before. But they had interpreters, and they were Indians from up north.
There were Aboriginal people there were chiefs, there were headmen, those types of things, but we were not allowed legal counsel. As a matter of fact, in the early 1900s, the Curve Lake First Nation tried to take some of their money that they had and hire a lawyer, and the federal government came along and fired them.
And they went off through these 7 communities, just whipping through them. The negotiations, such as they were, and the conclusion of the treaties was over in a matter of weeks. And then it was done.
When negotiations were complete, the Mississauga First Nations who participated in the Williams Treaty believed that they had agreed to share about 20,000 square miles of their traditional territory with European settlers in exchange for a one-time payment of $25 per person and a lump sum payment to the First Nations governments of about $230,000. But an additional clause is believed to have been added to the treaty by government officials after it was signed.
They had the thing all set out, and then they said, we'll have to take this away and get it typed up, and all you'll have to do when we bring it back is sign it. And they added some stuff into it while they had it away.
That day, the government took our sustenance. They've inserted the basket clause, which is a very highly legalese wording, basically saying that we gave up everything that day, including, jokingly say, the right to breathe. They said you can no longer hunt and fish, and it's not only hunting and fishing. Remember that that's more man's activities. What about the women's activities, like picking berries, picking birch bark? In order for us to live off the land, we had to start to be sneaky. We started to be called poachers. That's the only way we could. We had to eat We had to eat.
Hunting wasn't like a recreational thing for us. Hunting for us, my interpretation of it was just a daily part of existing. In order to survive, we had to hunt, we had to gather.
Were the commissioners innocent of trickery? I don't know. But it seems to me like, when I look at it as a person living here in the community, I just cannot see where the First Nation people would have said, take away my livelihood, it's okay,
It definitely changed. It changed our community. A lot of people were forced to go work off the reserve to support their families. People went to logging camps in the north. People went to Peterborough to work on the big projects like the Trent 7 Waterway, the lift locks, and they worked for different farmers. So it changed over a short period of time. It really changed the way we lived. And I'm sure, and I've read that there's social or psychological effects of having the things you value taken away on you.
The Williams Treaty First Nations are the only First Nations in Canada whose rights to hunt and fish have been held to be extinguished by the Supreme Court, by all the courts. At the end of it, a document was produced which may or may not have reflected what people understood, but which certainly within a decade was being interpreted by the province of Ontario as meaning that the people who signed it had given up all their rights. And the moment that interpretation hit the street, those people were protesting immediately and saying, no, we never would have agreed to that. It's not what it said. I'll go to jail before I'll give up my right to fish or my right to hunt or my right to trap. And many of them did.
We're living on the land, people who live in a sustainable fashion, that we made sure that if we were to use the land, that it would last us forever. However, what happened with the 1923 treaty, because we were forbidden to live on the land, we had to sneak around. Of course, the government on the other side had all kinds of game wardens here. It almost seemed like at times there was an army of game wardens looking over us.
It meant that you'd have to always be on the lookout for the game wardens. You rarely wore orange, so you're putting yourself at safety risks.
There's a lot of documented evidence where the people said they just gave up trapping because they were being run off the land. In some cases, being shot at.
The treaties that had been signed prior to the 1923 Williams Treaties had outlined promises to the Mississauga, which were not always fulfilled.
Agreements have been not honored. There's all kinds of stories of this dishonorable conduct by the colonial settler government, but we're still negotiating. We're still following up on lawsuits, but lawsuits mean that if we go to the settler government and their courts for resolution, And how fair is that, right? There was never any clause for resolution built into these treaties and agreements. So if we were to disagree, we go to them.
Now, if it was true that they kept to the agreement with their treaties, First Nations wouldn't be in the situation that they were in. It was supposed to be equal partners. They call us, treaty Indians. Yes, we signed a treaty. Who else signed that treaty for it to become an agreement? I hope you don't mind me saying, but you are also a treaty person. Because your government that represented you signed that treaty. And all that is there is supposed to be shared equally.
I'm at the stage now in life where it doesn't really matter. If they charge me, I'll go to their court, I'll tell them my story. If I have to go to jail, I'll eat their food and I'll sleep in their bed. It doesn't put any fear into me anymore. I would like somehow or another, someday, my people to be free to follow a lifestyle where they can, as Mississauga people, be free to live off the land.
Today, in Ontario, we are all treaty people. We all have the responsibility of upholding the agreements that were signed, which allowed for settlement and the way of life we enjoy today.
We lost our country. We lost it. You got to stay where they put you. If they want to make a white man out of Indian, they'll do it someday. You're not very far away from now.